a silent watchtower stands at the heart of a screaming galaxy. Within its gilded halls, figures of gold and adamantium move with a grace that belies their purpose. They are jailers of a dead god, guardians of a silent throne, and for 10,000 years they have been the perfect inactive heart of a decaying empire. They are the ultimate weapon locked in its own sheath. They are the emperor's final argument whispered only to the dust of an empty throne room. They are the Adeptus Custodes. The emperor's greatest warriors stood at his side for 10,000 years, and for most of that time, they did absolutely nothing. This is not a story of their glory in battle, but of the terrible, crushing weight of their inaction. It is the chronicle of a self-imposed prison, a golden cage built from grief and duty, whose bars were forged in the fires of a single, unforgivable failure. While the Imperium of man burned, while stars were extinguished and a billion souls cried out for salvation, the 10,000 stood their watch. Their silence was not peace. It was a wound upon history, a vacuum of power into which rushed every horror the galaxy could conceive. And the cost of their perfect static loyalty was a price paid in worlds, in blood, and in the slow, grinding death of the very dream they were created to protect. To understand their stillness, one must first understand the moment it began. The Horus heresy was over. The Great War was won, but the victory was ash. Terra was a graveyard, the skies choked with the smoke of pyres and the ghosts of orbital bombardments. The traitor legions had been broken and scattered, but not before they had reached the Sanctum Imperialis and torn the heart out of the nascent Imperium. The Emperor, master of mankind, architect of a secular, rational future, was now a shattered, dying psychic entity, sustained only by the arcane machinery of the Golden Throne. He who had walked among them as a king and a father was now a silent, screaming horror, a god in spite of himself. In the immediate aftermath, a profound shock settled over the survivors. For the Adeptus Custodes, this was not merely the death of a leader. It was the death of their purpose. They had been forged for a single, absolute task, to be the incorruptible, unbreachable shield around the physical form of the Emperor. They were his companions, his counselors, his final sanction. They were the last wall, the line that could never break, and it had broken. While they fought with sublime and terrible fury across the Lion's Gate and the Eternity Wall, a path had been cleared. The arch-traitor Horus had faced the Emperor, and the Custodes had not been there. They had failed. It is believed that the decision to withdraw was not a single grand declaration. There was no edict issued by the Captain General of the time, Constantine Valdor, whose own fate remains one of the great shrouded mysteries of the age. Instead, the few surviving records suggest it was a slow, dawning horror that calcified into doctrine. The Custodes looked upon the ruin of their master, enthroned in his agony, and saw the totality of their failure. Their duty had not been to the Imperium. It had not been to mankind. It had been to him. And in that singular duty, they had been found wanting. The shame was absolute, a psychic poison that seeped into the very core of their being. And so, they made a new oath. A silent, collective vow of penance. They would never fail again. They would never leave his side again. And so began the Long Watch. As the Imperium was remade in the shadow of the heresy, as the High Lords of Terra first convened, and the structures of a new, bleaker age were erected, the Custodes retreated. They sealed themselves within the vast, labyrinthine confines of the imperial palace. Their world shrank from a galaxy-spanning crusade to the silent, echoing corridors of the Sanctum Imperialis. Their mandate, once as boundless as the Emperor's ambition, was now reduced to the dimensions of a single room, a single throne. They became the wardens of the silent king. In the centuries that followed, their vigil took on a monastic, ritualistic quality. They patrolled halls no enemy had walked in millennia. They practiced battle drills against phantom foes, their Auramite war gear, the finest in the galaxy, gleaming under light that never saw a sun. They memorized the countless tactical doctrines of the Great Crusade, military philosophies for wars they would never again fight. They maintained their guardian spears and sentinel blades to a state of molecular perfection, weapons that would taste no blood but that of their own kin in the endless simulations of the blood games. They became perfect statues in a perfect museum, their every action a testament to a glory that was dead and a duty that had become a curse. They watched, they waited. And the galaxy, for the most part, forgot they even existed. Their self-imposed prison was a fortress of contradictions. Within its walls resided the most potent concentration of individual warriors humanity had ever produced. A single custodian was the equal of a dozen space marines, a whirlwind of genetic alchemy, arcane science, and psycho-spiritual conditioning. Each was a master strategist, a consummate warrior, a living repository of forgotten knowledge. Their minds were fortresses, their bodies paragons, their loyalty an elemental force. They were, in short, the solution to 1,000 of the Imperium's woes, and they were a solution that would never be deployed. This is the central tension, the grand tragedy of the Adeptus Custodes. Their greatest strength, their absolute focus on the person of the Emperor, became their greatest burden. Their perfection became a cage. While the nascent Imperium struggled through the brutal centuries of the Scouring, hunting down the remnants of the traitor legions, the Custodes stood guard over a corpse. While the War of the Beast brought the Imperium to the very brink of annihilation, as Orc empires rose to a scale not seen since the dawn of humanity and Terra itself was threatened, the Custodes polished their spears and recited the histories of battles fought 10,000 years prior. The Imperial fists, their brothers in the defense of Terra, bled and died to hold the line, led by the last loyalist Primarch, Vulcan. Yet the 10,000 did not stir. Their duty, as they now interpreted it, was architectural. They were no longer a shield, they were a wall. None can say for certain what passed through the mind of a custodian during the long, silent centuries. Unlike space marines, who are psychologically rebuilt into instruments of war, a custodian retains the full weight of his humanity, elevated to a transhuman scale. They feel grief, pride, and shame with a depth and clarity that a mortal mind could not withstand. What then did it mean for such a being, forged for glorious purpose, to be denied that purpose for 100 lifetimes? To know that beyond the palace walls, everything their master had built was crumbling into dogma and decay, and to be forbidden by their own oath from intervening? The records are silent on this point, for the Custodes are a brotherhood of silence, yet it is believed the psychological cost was immense. They channeled their martial nature into the blood games, elaborate and lethal war simulations held within the palace grounds. These were not mere training exercises. They were rituals of atonement. The objective was often not to win, but to find a flaw in the palace's defenses, to simulate a successful assassination of the emperor. Each loss was a fresh wound, a reminder of their single ultimate failure. They were endlessly reenacting their greatest shame, flagellating themselves with phantom blades to keep the memory of their inadequacy sharp. It was a mechanism for stasis, a way to justify their continued inaction by constantly proving to themselves that the threat was ever present, even when it was only an echo in their own minds. The scale of their absence is a litany of galactic catastrophes. During the Age of Apostasy, when the High Lord Goge von Dyer plunged the Imperium into a bloody civil war and the ecclesiarchy's madness threatened to consume the segmentum solar, the Custodes remained within their sanctum. They were mere meters away from the High Lord's chambers, an army of demigods who could have ended the tyranny in a single silent coup. But their mandate was the Emperor, not the Imperium. They watched as Van Dyer's reign of terror unfolded, as the brides of the Emperor were sacrificed, as brother fought brother on the very soil of Terra. Only when the madness threatened the sanctity of the palace itself did they act, and even then, it was with a cold, precise minimalism that spoke not of liberation, but of boundary enforcement, centuries stacked into millennia. The Nova Terra Interregnum saw the Imperium split in two. The tyrannic wars saw entire sectors devoured by a ravenous alien intelligence. The Gothic War saw the forces of chaos return in strength, their fleets commanded by the despoiler himself. In each crisis, the Space Marines, the Imperial Guard, the Imperial Navy, they fought and they bled and they died in their trillions. And in the heart of it all, the 10,000 stood their vigil. They were a myth, a legend whispered by a few high-ranking officials. To the common man of the Imperium, they were less real than the angels and demons of the Imperial Creed. Their inaction was so absolute, so profound, that they faded from the consciousness of the very civilization they were sworn to. The golden cage had become a tomb, and they were its willing, living occupants. This adherence to a static duty was rooted in the memory of failure. It was a penance, an eternal act of contrition for the sins of the Horus heresy. They had been given a wide-ranging authority during the Great Crusade, acting as the Emperor's emissaries and enforcers. That authority in their minds had led to the pride and division that allowed the heresy to fester. They had been scattered, engaged on 1,000 fronts, when they should have been at their master's side. The retreat into the palace was a conscious rejection of that past. They narrowed their focus to a single point, believing that in absolute, unwavering simplicity, they could find redemption. They would guard the body and let others worry about the soul. This created a bitter, unspoken schism between them and the other institutions of the Imperium. To the newly formed Inquisition, the Custodes were an infuriating, untouchable mystery. To the Adeptus Astartes, they were relics of a forgotten age, their glory a matter of history rather than present reality. The High Lords of Terra learned to govern around them, treating the Imperial Palace as a sacred but inert monument. The Custodes, in turn, viewed the burgeoning Imperium with a quiet, aristocratic disdain. They saw the rise of the ecclesiarchy as a betrayal of the Emperor's imperial truth. They saw the dogmatic, fearful bureaucracy as a corruption of his vision for a rational, enlightened humanity. They were guardians of a past that no one else remembered and judges of a present they refused to engage with. There were, of course, exceptions. The eyes of the Emperor were those few custodians who, having reached an age where their combat prowess began to fractionally decline, chose to leave the palace. They divested themselves of their Oramite armor and their titles, taking on the guise of humble travelers or forgotten nobles. They moved through the Imperium as silent observers, a distributed intelligence network loyal only to their brotherhood. But this was not an interventionist force. They were spies, not soldiers. They gathered information, assessed threats, and sent their knowledge back to Terra, but they did not act. They were a testament to the Custodes' awareness of the galaxy's decay, but also to their refusal to halt it. The existence of the Eyes only deepens the tragedy. They knew the house was burning down, room by room, but their only response was to take meticulous notes on the nature of the flames. Yet, this gilded silence, This 10,000-year penance could not last. The galaxy does not respect oaths, and reality has little time for tradition. The end of the 41st millennium brought with it a storm that would shake the foundations of the Imperium and crack the walls of the Golden Cage. The 13th Black Crusade of Abaddon the Despoiler succeeded where all others had failed. The fortress world of Cadia, the gatekeeper of the Eye of Terror for 10 millennia, finally fell. And with its fall, the fabric of reality tore asunder. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, ripped across the galaxy from end to end, a maelstrom of warp energy that cut the Imperium in half and unleashed untold legions of demons upon its benighted worlds. And this time the war came to Terra. A vast host of Khorne's demons manifested in the Sol system, their target nothing less than the throne world itself. The enemy was no longer a distant threat to be observed from afar. It was a physical, existential crisis at the very gates of the Sanctum Imperialis. The thing they had sworn to protect was now under direct, immediate assault in a way it had not been since the days of the heresy. For the first time in 10 millennia, the mandate of inaction and the mandate of protection were in direct conflict. To remain within the palace was to allow the enemy to reach the Golden Throne. To leave the palace was to break the sacred vow that had defined them for an age. Into this crisis walked a ghost. The Primarch Robout Guilliman, Lord of Ultramar, returned from the brink of death through a combination of arcane technology and Eldar mysticism. He arrived at Terra not as a supplicant, but as a whirlwind of change and authority. He looked upon the decaying, superstitious Imperium and saw a nightmare. And he looked upon the Adeptus Custodes, the golden, silent figures of his father's household, and he did not see honorable sentinels. He saw failure. He saw a sword that had remained in its scabbard while the world fell to ruin. The confrontation between Guilliman and the Captain General of the Custodes, Trajan Valoris, was a clash of philosophies. Guilliman, the ultimate pragmatist, saw an army of demigods standing idle while the Imperium faced its greatest ever crisis. Valoris, the inheritor of 10,000 years of tradition, saw the keeper of a sacred trust, a duty that could not be abandoned. But the logic of the situation was undeniable. The demonic tide was rising. Terra itself was threatened. The Long Watch had to end. In a decision that shattered 100 centuries of doctrine, Captain General Valoris declared that the Emperor's shield could no longer remain a static wall. To protect the throne, they had to pacify the galaxy that threatened it. The Emperor's mercy, he argued, was not a passive state. It was an active force. And the Custodes would be its delivery mechanism. The Golden Cage was thrown open. For the first time since the Great Crusade, the 10,000 marched to war. A galaxy that had forgotten them was about to relearn the meaning of fear. The return of the Custodes to the battlefields of the 41st millennium was the arrival of myth made manifest. To the beleaguered soldiers of the Astra Militarum, they were angels of vengeance, golden giants, who moved with impossible speed and killed with an artist's precision. To the Adeptus Astartes, they were a humbling reminder of their own engineered inferiority, a vision of what their primarchs had been. Where a custodian stood, the line did not break. Where they charged, the enemy was not merely defeated, it was annihilated, unmade, with a contemptuous fury that bordered on the sublime. On 100 worlds, a small force of custodians would turn the tide of a hopeless war. They were not an army in the conventional sense. They were a collection of individual heroes, each capable of single-handedly dismantling enemy command structures, assassinating demonic warlords, and weathering firepower that would obliterate entire squads of lesser warriors. They fought with the weapons of an elder age, wielding guardian spears that spat bolts of explosive fury and sentinel blades that cut through reality itself. They arrived on wings of gold, teleporting into the heart of battle from orbiting warships that were themselves works of art, relics of a lost technological supremacy. They were magnificent. But their return was not a simple triumph. It was a tragedy played out on a galactic scale. For 10,000 years, they had remained perfect and unchanging, while the galaxy had moved on. They were fighting in a civilization they no longer understood. Their doctrines, honed in the fires of the Great Crusade, were ill-suited to the grinding, attritional warfare of the 41st millennium. They understood fighting traitors and Xenos, but they did not understand fighting for a populace steeped in superstitious fear, a people who looked upon them not as saviors, but as terrifying, inhuman demigods. Furthermore, their numbers were terrifyingly few. The 10,000 had always been a symbolic title, but now, spread across a war-torn galaxy, it felt like a pittance. Every loss was a catastrophe. The creation of a single custodian was a process that took decades, a resource-intensive miracle of bioalchemy that the fractured Imperium could barely support. When a custodian fell, a hero of the age was lost forever, and they were falling. For all their transhuman resilience, they were not immortal. They could be drowned in numbers, overwhelmed by psychic power, or laid low by the arcane weaponry of ancient foes. Their return was a glorious final blaze, but it was shadowed by the constant, looming threat of their own extinction. The true cost of their silence was now being paid in arrears. As they moved through the Imperium, they saw with their own perfectly eidetic memories the full extent of the decay. They saw the ecclesiarchy's fanatical priests preaching a doctrine of hate and ignorance, a grotesque parody of the imperial truth they had once championed. They saw the administratum's crushing bureaucracy, the Mechanicus's hoarded knowledge, the Inquisition's paranoid cruelty. This was the Imperium that had festered in their absence. Every world they saved was a monument to the 1,000 worlds that had fallen while they stood their watch. Every soul they protected was a reminder of the trillions who had perished, their cries for help unheard beyond the gilded walls of the palace. This is the burden they now carry, a burden perhaps greater than any other. Unlike a space marine, whose memory is often scrubbed and reshaped, a custodian remembers everything. They remember the emperor walking the halls of his palace, not as a broken god on a throne, but as a living man. They remember the promises of the Great Crusade, the vision of a united, enlightened humanity ruling the stars in reason and strength. And now they must fight and die for the Imperium of the 41st millennium, a superstitious, xenophobic, decaying empire that is the antithesis of everything they were created to build. They are fighting for the wreckage of a dream they watched die. Their new war is not just against the Xenos and the heretic. It is a war against the bitter truth of their own long failure. Their inaction did not preserve the Emperor's legacy. It allowed it to be corrupted into something unrecognizable. Their vigil was never simply a matter of guarding a location. It was a form of psychic endurance. For 10,000 years, every custodian on watch has been in the presence of the Golden Throne, and thus in the presence of the Emperor's immense, unending psychic agony. That silent scream is the background radiation of their existence, a constant reminder of their master's sacrifice and their own shame. To remain at their post was to share that burden, to stand with him in his suffering. To leave was to turn their back on that pain, a betrayal they could not contemplate. Their decision to march out, therefore, was not a liberation. It was an even greater sacrifice. They left the side of their suffering master to save the crumbling house he had built, trading the focused agony of the throne room for the wider, more desperate pain of a dying galaxy. Now, under the pragmatic leadership of Captain General Trajan Valoris, they are a proactive force. Valorous understands the debt of their inaction and is determined to repay it. He wields the 10,000 as a golden spear, a strategic asset to be deployed with lethal precision against the Imperium's most dire threats. He counsels Guilliman, leads armies, and prosecutes wars on a galactic scale. The golden figures are in motion, and the foundations of the galaxy tremble. But the fundamental question remains unanswered. Is it too little, too late? Can a few thousand perfect warriors hold back a tide of infinite darkness that has had 10 millennia to build? The long watch is over, but the vigil is eternal. Even now, with their comrades fighting on 1,000 fronts, a contingent of custodes remains on Terra. They still walk the silent halls. They still stand guard over the golden throne. Their primary duty has not been replaced, only supplemented. The silence of the Sanctum Imperialis is still their home. The Emperor's psychic scream, their constant companion. The horror of the Adeptus Custodes was never that they were lazy or cowardly or derelict in their duty. The horror is that their inaction was, by their own grim logic, the perfect fulfillment of their oath. And the price of that perfect, unswerving loyalty was a galaxy in flames. Their greatest virtue was the Imperium's damnation. They are active now. They fight for the Imperium they allowed to decay. They die for a dream they know is dead. But the galaxy is darker than ever. The golden throne is failing. The great rift boils across the heavens. The enemies of humanity are stronger and more numerous than ever before. They left their prison to save the Imperium, but they may have only succeeded in buying it a few more moments of agonizing life before the inevitable end. Their watch has not ended. It has merely expanded to encompass the stars. And now, as the final darkness closes in, the 10,000 stand guard over a tomb the size of a galaxy and wait for a dawn that will never come.